So now coming to the question bank, we are done with two deficit, right? We were doing budgetary deficit and we are already done with two, right? We are done with revenue deficit.
Yes,
We are
ma'am.
done with, okay, we are done with revenue deficit plus we are done with fiscal deficit.
Yes.
Today we'll start with primary deficit. Okay, so before going, we'll be discussing just a recap. Revenue deficit, you all know difference between total expenditure and total revenue receipt is known as revenue deficit. Okay, and what was the implication? First, if the situation is of revenue deficit, that means it is showing that government is unable, right? Inability of the government to meet the expenditure. And next, it was showing that this saving, because right now government is in problem. So what government will be doing? Government will be using the money which government saved, right? So from different sector, government will be doing, keep taking out the money. So that is opposite of saving, right? This savings. And next, if there are two things which government can do. Either government will be borrowing something. If government borrows something, that will increase the liability. And if government sells something, then that will decrease the assets of the government. Next, if government keeps on doing this, like the expenditure keeps on increasing, you know, then the problem of inflation will be there. Like the prices will be high, because from where government wants money? From people. So now what government will do? Government will increase the prices. Okay. And if government keeps on, borrowing things, so it will lead to burden for the future generation. Clear?
Yes,
Implication of
ma'am.
revenue deficit. Halima,
Yes.
Sana, Madi.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Now the government is in problem. So of course we have to suggest something to government that this is what you can do so that your problem will be reduced. Okay. So first thing is that I'll tell government to do like stop the expenditure, and second I'll just ask the government to earn more revenue. So how government can reduce public expenditure? By reducing the money which government was giving in the form of subsidies, and plus whatever money government was spending on non-planned expenditure, that also government has to reduce. Next, measure to increase revenue. From where government can increase the revenue? First, increase the taxes, okay, plus impose new tax. Second, government should try to increase income from the public sector. Like they can, government can ask the public sector to pay more tax or something like that. And next one, last was tax evasion. Tax evasion is basically when you are unable to pay the tax. So if earlier there was 10 defaulters, now government has to make some schemes or something like that. That will okay, that will control the tax evasion. Like the people who were trying to find some alternative ways to skip from the tax, we have to control that. Okay, this is how revenue deficit will be controlled. Now fiscal deficit, as you all know, it is the difference between total expenditure and total receipt. And total expenditure is made up of two parts: revenue expenditure and capital expenditure. Total receipt also, to revenue receipt and the capital receipt. Okay. Now implication. Implication first, debt trap. Like this is a situation where you borrow something and interest rate will be there. And in order to repay the loan, you are going to borrow the money from some other person. So this is a trap. In order to pay the previous one, you are again taking the loans. In order to pay that one in future, again you will take loan. So that is a debt trap. And foreign dependence, a country, when government borrows money from rest of the world, like apart from its own country, if you are taking money from someone else, maybe someone's government, right, some other country government, so that will lead to sometimes what happened, the country who gave us the money, they try to interfere in our economy, and they sometimes try to make and because of that, economic slavery, like you are becoming the slave of some other country. Whatever they will be saying, you have to follow it. So that situation comes. And sometimes the country who is giving us loan, they try to dictate us, they try to overrule us. Okay. Next, cause inflation. As you know, if government will, in order to borrow, government is borrowing things. Now they have to repay their things. So what government will be doing? Of course, money circulation will be there, and the problem of inflation will be there. If there is lots of money, when government takes money from RBI, there will be lots of money, and when you have lots of money, then you are demanding a lot. So in order to control the higher demand, what government will be doing? Government will be basically increasing the prices, so that earlier if 5 people were demanding things, now only 2 people will be there to demand. Next, financial burden for future generation. Of course, if you are taking the loans right now, future generation has to pay, right? So this is the problem future generation do get from the previous government, or you can say previous generation, because interest rate gets accumulated plus the loan rate also increases. So that's why the problem of financial burden for future generation comes. Now again, the fiscal and the revenue deficit are both the same. So of course the measures are also same. If you want to two things. First, reduce your expenditure and increase your revenue. How to reduce that? Subsidies, just stop giving subsidies, or if you are giving it, just cut down the ratio. Next, non-planned expenditure, you don't have to spend much. Then how you can increase the revenue? Tax rate increase. You can increase the tax rate, plus you can increase income from the public sector, and tax evasion should be controlled. Okay, till here any doubt, Halima, Sana and Mahdi?
No. No, ma'am.
Okay, I hope you are getting it and you are learning it side by side.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, good. Okay, so now we are going to start with next one, which is primary deficit. Okay, so this is a very you can say precise concept, because questions come directly from here. Now, primary deficit. Primary deficit is basically the difference between fiscal deficit and the interest payment. So, quickly write third, primary deficit and definition. The difference between fiscal deficit and interest payment is known as primary deficit. Quickly write it down, then we'll move. Done?
Done, ma'am.
Okay. So, I hope you have written that difference between fiscal deficit and the interest payment is known as primary deficit. Okay. So, basically what happens, this is a situation. Okay. So, interest payment are basically, for example, you borrowed something, right? And your interest payment is and you are paying the interest over it. That is known as interest payment. I hope you people are aware of it. Interest payment. If you borrowed something, you have to pay interest, and that is known as interest payment. So what is the formula? Like, the formula is primary deficit. It is primary deficit equals to fiscal deficit minus interest payment. Okay. So in this situation, what happened? For example, you borrowed nothing and your interest is 0. Right? Then what will happen? Your primary deficit will be equals to your fiscal deficit. Okay. So in exam hall, you will get a question like this. If your interest payment is 0, so what is your primary deficit? And the entries will be like this. For example, your entries are like this is 1000 rupees. Your interest payment is 0. Your revenue deficit is 500, something like that. Okay. And the examiner will be asking you, if your interest payment is 0, what is your primary deficit? So at that moment, your primary deficit will be 100. Why? Because when interest payment is 0, you don't have any, you have not taken any loan or something like that, and your interest payment is 0. In that case, your fiscal deficit is equal to primary deficit. Okay. And in case, I'll ask you how you can take out fiscal deficit from the primary deficit. So at this moment, it will be plus interest payment. Just remember two things. First point which you have to remember, if your interest payment is 0, then your primary deficit is equals to your fiscal deficit. Okay. Primary deficit is equal to your fiscal deficit. And second thing which you have to remember is that in case primary deficit is, you are subtracting interest payment. But when comes for fiscal deficit, you are adding interest payment. Okay, just remember primary deficit means you are excluding the interest payment. You are not including interest payment. But when you calculate fiscal deficit, you are including interest payment with the primary deficit. Just remember one thing. Second point which you have to remember, that fiscal deficit include, if you are calculating fiscal deficit, prime interest payment. Okay, but in case if you are calculating primary deficit, you have to exclude. You are not including the interest payment, right? So 3 points. First, if your interest payment is 0, then primary deficit is equals to fiscal deficit. And second, if you are calculating fiscal deficit, then you are including, because it is plus IP, right? But in case if you are calculating primary deficit, then you are going to exclude. You are not going to include the interest payment. Clear?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so just revise it. Just remember 3 points. Then you'll tell me. First, Sanya will tell me 3 points. These 3 points which I mentioned, and then Halima, then Mahdi. Mahdi, I don't think he's here. So I'm just giving you 1 minute quickly. I'm just explaining it again. First point, if your interest payment is 0, then your primary deficit is equals to fiscal deficit. Second point, if you are calculating fiscal deficit, then there you have to include interest payment. You have to add interest payment. But if you are calculating this primary deficit, then you are not going to add interest payment. You are excluding it. Okay. So I'm just giving you 1 minute. Then I'll ask Sanya, then Halima, then Mahdi. Okay. So Sanya, just tell me the 3 points.
Yes, ma'am. So if interest payment is equal to 0, then primary deficit will be equal to physical deficit. Then second point is if we have to find physical deficit, then we have to include interest on payments. Then if we have to find primary deficit, then we have to include
Exclude.
exclude interest payments.
Yeah, very good. Okay, next Halima.
In first point, if interest payments is 0, then primary deficit and physical deficit are equal. Then second point, if we want to find physical deficit, we can include primary deficit with we can include interest payment with the primary deficit. And in third point, if you want to find primary deficit, we can subtract interest payment from physical deficit.
Yeah, very good, very good. Okay, Mahdi, am I audible?
Yes, from you are.
Okay, just tell.
Ma'am, if we have to find interest payment, then we have to take interest payment as 0, and we
No, Mahdi. It's like if your interest payment is 0, okay, then your primary deficit is equals to fiscal deficit. Okay, interest payment is 0, then your primary deficit is equals to fiscal deficit. And in second case, if you want to calculate fiscal deficit, then you have to include the interest payment. But if you want to calculate primary deficit, then you have to exclude. You are not going to include interest payment. So first point, if your IP, if your interest payment is 0, then your primary deficit will be equals to fiscal deficit. But if you want to calculate fiscal deficit, you have to include IP, the interest payment, and if you want to calculate PD, the fiscal deficit, sorry, primary, yeah, then you have to exclude. Clear?
Yeah.
Okay, students. So let's just move. Okay. Now, basically, the definition is clear. Now, implication. Primary deficit is defined as fiscal deficit minus this, no? So from here, you will be writing primary deficit. Instead of it, you are going to write primary deficit. Okay, you are going to write PD. Primary deficit includes the amount of borrowing requirement to meet the expenditure other than the interest payment. Okay, so primary deficit means how much. See, you are now in problem. Okay, so for example, you already have taken loan from somewhere. Okay, so you have to, with the help of primary deficit, you will able to get it like how much money you need, right, to cover this primary deficit, but other than interest payment. You don't have to include the previous interest. You have just see, whenever you are in problem, what the suggestion is basically, or what the implication is, that will let you know how much money you need. For example, you are like the primary deficit 100 rupees. That means you need 100 rupees. You will be borrowing 100 rupees. But other than interest payment, you don't have to calculate the previous amount as well. For example, you have right now you have to pay 100 rupees to someone, and earlier the 50 rupees was there. So if I'll ask you to calculate primary deficit, you are not going to include this term only. This one is your previous thing, the interest payment. You are not going to include this. Okay, so primary deficit indicates the amount of borrowing required to meet expenditure other than interest payment. So how much borrowing is needed, but other than interest payment. If interest payment you are excluding. Now, fiscal deficit refers to borrowing exclusive of interest payment. So fiscal deficit also means borrowing, but inclusive. In fiscal deficit, you include interest payment, right? So fiscal deficit refers to borrowing inclusive of interest payment. Primary deficit refers to the borrowing requirement exclusive of interest payment. I hope now you are getting it, right? You have the second and third point are written over here, that fiscal deficit refers to borrowing inclusive. Okay, amount of borrowing you need, but inclusive of interest payment. But primary deficit refers to borrowing requirement exclusive. You are not including interest payment. It implies that if primary deficit is 0, then fiscal deficit will be equal to interest payment, which indicate the interest payment on previous loan have lent of money. Now see, it implies that primary deficit is 0. Your formula is primary deficit equals to fiscal deficit minus interest payment. If primary deficit is 0, right, then your fiscal deficit will be like whatever your fiscal deficit is, you are going to write only the interest payment. Clear? Just a minute. I'll just share my screen, the whiteboard. Okay. Just remember one thing, students. See, in exam hall, they can ask you anything. So be ready for all the things. Your formula was primary deficit equals to fiscal deficit minus interest payment. Okay. Now, what the examiner is saying, if your PD is 0, your primary deficit is 0, then what is the situation? Then, of course, your FD, this your FD that will go here. It is like this, equals to IP. Then your FD will equals to IP. So that means how much, there is no current borrowing. You only have to pay interest, right? So if your PD is what we studied, if your interest payment is 0, if your interest payment is 0, then your primary deficit is equals to interest payment. Okay, sorry, fiscal deficit. Okay, but in case if your PD is 0, then your fiscal deficit is equals to your interest payment. Getting it?
Yes.
Yeah. And they can even ask you if your fiscal deficit is 0. Right? If your fiscal deficit is 0, then your PD, your primary deficit will be 0 plus IP. That means your PD is equals to IP. You just don't have to mug up things. Just remember the formula and you can put the value, you will get the answer. So three things will be there. If your PD is 0, then in this case, your fiscal deficit will be equals to your interest payment. Okay. Second, if your FD, your fiscal deficit is 0, see, the situation is here. Okay. If your fiscal deficit is 0, for example, okay, then your PD will be equals to your interest payment. Okay. Second thing. Third situation, if your interest payment is 0, then your PD will be equals to your fiscal deficit. The third thing. Clear? These 3 points. You can write it down if you want to write it. These points. PD, if your primary deficit is 0, okay, then what is happening? Your fiscal deficit is equals to your interest payment. If your fiscal deficit is 0, then your PD is equals to going to be IP, equals to IP. And if your IP is 0, then your PD is going to be equals to FD. Clear?
Yes,
Just
ma'am.
write it down. Before implication, just write this down. Or okay, just a minute. Just don't write it down. Just write implications. Okay, just write implications and write the first point that primary deficit indicate the amount of borrowing required to meet the expenditure other than interest payment. Then write fiscal deficit refers to borrowing inclusive of interest payment, and primary deficit refers to exclusive of interest payment. It implies that primary deficit is 0, then fiscal deficit will be equals to just write till here, second point, and then I'll just tell you the third and fourth point. Okay? Getting it, students?
Yes, ma'am. Can you explain the first line, what we should write?
Okay, first line you have to write implications of primary deficit, and here you have to write primary deficit. Primary deficit indicates the amount of borrowing required to meet the expenditure other than interest payment. Okay?
Okay, ma'am.
And after that, fiscal deficit refers to borrowing inclusive of interest payment, and primary deficit refers to borrowing requirement exclusive of interest payment. Okay?
Yes. Done, ma'am.
Okay, I'll just wait for one more minute.
Finish.
Okay, good. Okay, now next line, third, fourth, and fifth line, you are going to write it like it implies that if you're going to make your own sentence. Okay, it implies that if primary deficit is 0, then fiscal just a minute. Share my screen. You are going to write your own sentence. Like, it implies that if your primary deficit is equals to 0, then your fiscal deficit will be equals to your interest payment. Then next, it implies that if your fiscal deficit is equals to 0, then your primary deficit is going to equals to your interest payment. Next, it implies that if your interest payment is 0, then your primary deficit is going to be equal to fiscal deficit. Clear?
Yes, ma'am.
Just write it down. Like, it implies that if your primary deficit is 0, then this will be the situation. If your fiscal deficit is 0, then this. And if your IP is 0, then this. You can write it in the sentence form. Plus, after that will be easy for you. Or if you want to write it in like statement form should be there, because you'll be getting marks of statements instead of this. But in like side by, if you write it down, if you want to write it down for your own knowledge, you can write it like this. But in exam hall, you have to write the statement.
Done, ma'am.
Okay, I'll just wait for a few more minutes. Okay, done. Madhi, you are here?
Yeah, ma'am, done.
Done? Okay.
Yeah, ma'am.
Okay. Okay. Now we are going to measures. Like, of course, now you are in problem. So, of course, there will be some solution, right? So, first, primary deficit indicates borrowing requirement of the government to meet the deficit other than interest payment. Therefore, effort should be made to reduce the fiscal deficit. Okay. So, clearly they have mentioned that, as I told you, if your interest payment is 0, then your primary deficit is equals to fiscal deficit. So, they have clearly mentioned over here that primary deficit indicates borrowing requirement of the government to meet the deficit other than interest payment. So therefore, if you will, only this is like if your interest payment is 0, right? Then you should focus on this. Like, if you will reduce the fiscal deficit, automatically your primary deficit will be decreased, right? So they have written that first they have introduced primary deficit means borrowing requirement, and then they told you therefore you should make efforts to reduce the fiscal deficit, and you know how to reduce the fiscal deficit. So simply you will here mention this point. After that, to reduce fiscal deficit. Now, as I told you in the first statement that you have to reduce the fiscal deficit, but how? To reduce fiscal deficit, interest payment should be reduced through repayment of loans as early as possible. And if you want to reduce fiscal deficit, right, as I told you, if your PD is 0, right, if your PD is 0, then your fiscal deficit is equals to your interest payment. So if you will, pay out all the loans on time, then your interest payment will be decreased. Okay, just don't get confused, students. I'll just explain. See, this is a story like primary deficit, fiscal deficit, and the interest payment. Okay, so primary deficit clearly said that I don't include this IP. So if you want to reduce primary deficit, you have to reduce the fiscal deficit. Okay, and when we came to fiscal deficit, he clearly said if you want to reduce fiscal deficit, then reduce the interest payment, like prepay all the loan on time so that there is no interest payment. So this is the story. When we came to primary deficit, then he told that reduce fiscal deficit. And when we came to fiscal deficit, he clearly said if you want to reduce fiscal deficit, just clear all the like whatever loan you have taken, just clear it out, and IP, like interest payment, just reduce it, and then only you can reduce the whole thing. So they are linked. Primary deficit told fiscal deficit to come down, and fiscal deficit told that if you want to reduce fiscal deficit, then you have to reduce the interest payment, like repay all the loan on time, so that there is no interest payment. Getting it, students?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so just quickly write these 2 points, then we'll start with numeric.
Done.
Done, ma'am.
Okay, so I'm just giving you 5 minutes, all of you. Just quickly revise the formulas. Okay, because now we'll start with the numerical. Okay, and in our next class, I'll take your test. Okay, for this chapter. Is it fine?
For this chapter, ma'am?
Yeah, government budget chapter. Sana, this will be your first test, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, so government budget, I'll be taking the test. Okay. I hope it's fine with everyone.
Yes, ma'am. When is it?
Yeah.
Next class?
Next class. That will be, I guess, on Saturday. Okay. Then, okay. So, students, what I'm going to do is, like, I'm going to take your 2 tests for this chapter. One will be theory, and one will be your numerical. Okay. So, which one you want me to take earlier? Because your next class will be on Saturday and then on Tuesday. So, for Tuesday portion, you have to learn things. Right. Of course, you have to learn lots of things over here. So, if you want, just let me know which one you are going to prefer, like first theory or first numerical.
Numerical means you will teach, then only we have to write.
Yeah, I'm just discussing it right now. And then on the basis of that, because numericals are like quite easier, you can say.
Ma'am, easier?
Numericals are better.
Numerical for this chapter, the numericals are easier. If you know the 3 formulas, you just have to put it down and you have to find out the value.
Numericals first.
Okay, numericals first. Okay. Okay, I'll just share my screen. Okay, you will get to know that the numericals are quite easy. I just need to tell you one more thing, because this is the only trick which they use in the questions is that portion. Okay, see, uh, you know, for I'll just share my whiteboard. Of course, you must be wondering, ma'am, how can numericals be easier, right? But yeah, they are. Madhi, they are easy. Okay. Okay. So, we students, you know that for fiscal deficit, you know the formula, right? Total plus total, right? But in case if, as I told you, it's of two types. One is receipt one, and one is the other one. But in case there is a situation where your fiscal deficit is equals to borrowing. Okay, this is the thing which you have to keep in mind. Somewhere you won't be getting the total, but instead of that, it will be written borrowing. So at that moment, if you don't find the entries of fiscal deficit, then no matter what, you are going to write fiscal deficit is equals to borrowing. Okay, just remember this one trick, because this is the trick which they use in exam, and others are like easy one. Okay. 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 See, and I just wanted you to write. Okay, that's fine. Okay, before numericals, I just want you to write this down. The difference between fiscal deficit and the primary deficit, right? So, fiscal deficit is like you know this. If you want to write it down, you can write it down. But if you don't want to write it down, it's fine. Like it is, I already explained you that fiscal deficit is something like you are including the interest payment, but for primary deficit, you are excluding it. So, this is the same thing. No need to just write it down. See, this is the question, right? You have to find the fiscal deficit. Now, coming to the formula, fiscal deficit, you know, total expenditure, total receipt, this is the formula, right? And total expenditure is divided into two, revenue expenditure and the capital expenditure, and total receipt are also divided revenue receipt and the capital receipt, right? Clear?
Yes.
These formula you have to keep in mind. But here, as I told you have to find fiscal deficit. Now, quickly, you will go to formula, you will check, ma'am, total expenditure and total revenue receipt. But in case you are not getting total expenditure, then you will find out other two things like the receipt part and the yeah. So here you got it, like you got revenue expenditure and others. There was no entry for the formula. So if you are not getting the entries, right? If you are not getting anything, this is for only fiscal deficit, not for others. Okay. For example, you are not getting total expenditure, total receipt. You just saw it. You got capital receipt. You didn't get total receipt. Also, you got revenue expenditure, but you didn't get total expenditure, right? So at that moment, what you will be doing, you will be coming to the borrowing. And here you have to find fiscal deficit. Most of the students think they are very smart, and what they do, they just write this formula, and over here what they do, they just write it like this, that total expenditure is not given, okay, zero. Whatever value is not given, they consider it zero. But no, whenever you are getting the question like this and the entries are not there only for fiscal deficit, then fiscal deficit will be equals to borrowing. So your answer is 32 billions. Why? Because here fiscal deficit was not given. Sorry, fiscal deficit you have to find, but entries were not there. Right, others entries was not there. That's why you took fiscal deficit equals to the borrowing. You will definitely get one question, because in exam hall we feel so pressurized. Whenever we see numericals, we just try to find out the things whatever it is mentioned in formula. But sometimes we forget that if entries are not given for fiscal deficit only, you are not going to take zero. You are going to take if any of the entries is not given. For example, total expenditure, total receipt is not given, then also it will be equals to zero. But for example, revenue expenditure is given, capital expenditure is given, revenue receipt is also given, but capital expenditure is not given, capital receipt is not given, that also your one entry is missing, right? So in that case also, you will consider fiscal deficit equals to borrowing. Clear?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Okay, so quickly just write it down, like just write first write numerical portion, and all the formulas you have already written, just write this entry. Okay, no need to write all the entries, just write 3-4 entries and the solution. Okay, clear? Write the question that from following, just write calculate fiscal deficit, these entries and the numerical and solution that fiscal deficit is equals to borrowing. And after that, quickly we'll move to next part.
Done now.
Okay, I'll just wait for 1 minute. Done? Both the girls?
Yes, ma'am.
Just give me one. Okay. So now you're getting this question, this one,
Yes, ma'am.
right? So basically these are the entries and now you have to find the things. Okay. Using the budget estimates of the government, this you have to find revenue deficit. Okay, this is a lengthy one. Okay, let's just take the small one. Okay, this is the thing. You have to find revenue deficit, fiscal deficit, and the primary deficit. Okay, this is how we are going to solve it. It's very easy. First, revenue deficit, you know the formula. Revenue expenditure minus revenue receipt. Clearly, you have to find this like this term, revenue expenditure and revenue receipt. You are going to subtract it. Done? I'm not going to I'm just asking done means got it?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, yeah. Yeah. Okay. Next one is fiscal deficit. You know the formula that total expenditure minus total receipt, but we have to exclude the borrowing. And you know total expenditure is made up of two parts, revenue expenditure plus capital expenditure. So revenue expenditure given, capital expenditure given, capital receipt given, revenue receipt given. So here you are not going to take borrowings equals to, you are going to take these entries. So what you will do, you will add revenue expenditure and capital expenditure and add revenue receipt and the revenue that expenditure. Then you will subtract it. So the answer will be this. Got it?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Just remember one thing here. What you are going to do, this is the formula, revenue receipt plus recovery of loans on the interest payment they have written. Okay, so just remember one thing, what you are going to write, recovery of loans on other receipt. So this is your other receipt. Clear?
Okay.
See, this is a confusing one. See, what your formula was this, but somewhere revenue receipt plus over here, what you are going to write? Revenue.
Capital receipt.
Yeah, but this is the capital receipt, right? But there they have written that recovery of loans. So this is what you are going to include it here. Why? Because your formula is that you have to exclude the borrowing. So capital is basically you are getting it, but other receipt. So recovery of loans. Whenever you are getting recovery of loans and other receipt, then instead of capital receipt, you are going to take this entry. Just remember this term. Okay. Recovery of loans, other receipt, you are going to write it here. And here you are going to write this term and you are going to why I have written, see, recovery of loans is basically you are taking money from someone. Okay. Now you have to exclude it. So they have given the entry, but somewhere you have to exclude the borrowings as well, right? So that's why instead of taking this, you're going to take the other end. Clear?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, just remember this term because in exam hall you'll get the direct end. Okay, there are high chances, like 2 or 3 chances that they give this type, something like this, but somewhere they'll be giving you the direct end. Okay. Next one is primary deficit. You have to find primary deficit is fiscal deficit minus interest payment. Okay, so fiscal deficit and the interest payment. You know the fiscal deficit is, you have already find it out. Fiscal deficit was this, and interest payment they have given 1020. So this is the answer. Clear?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So just give me 1 minute. The markers. Okay, students. I'm just sharing my screen. Let me know if it is visible. Is it clear? See, in our next class, what we will do now? We will first discuss the numericals and after that, I'll give you the question. Like 30 minutes or 20 minutes, we will discuss. And after that, I'll just give you the questions. Is it fine?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, okay. So then, let's just do this one. Okay. I'll just quickly write it down, this one. Okay. I hope my screen is visible. You can zoom it, right?
We
Can you
can't
make
zoom
it
in.
bigger? I can't zoom.
Okay, okay. Okay, so first of all, I'll just show you the question. Is it visible?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes.
Okay. Just don't write everything. Just write calculate revenue deficit, fiscal deficit, primary deficit, and these entries. And after that, I'll show you this. If you want to solve it, you can solve it, or other, I'll just show my screen for the solution.
Done now.
Done with the solution as well. Okay, just write the solutions. Okay.